Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert, and I'm really excited to be here today and share my experience about the style guides and the evolution of them, more specifically, and the workflows, how they were evolved from the first steps and how they're used nowadays in modern development teams by best developers out there, and most likely you as well, after this talk, or already before that as well. And last 5 years, I've been mostly working in large-scale projects within a huge development teams. Before that, as the head of front-end at OK.ru, which is a top 10 world social network, maybe also known in Poland, I'm not sure. And most recently, I moved to Amsterdam to work at BACKBASE as a senior front-end consultant, where I work every day with even more front-end developers, so you could see the numbers. Quite huge teams if we are talking about one product, not a set of different services and a set of different websites. And of course, you could add to this backend developers, managers, and all the people that are involved in front-end development process. And being always focused on development process automation and trying to make the teamwork as efficient as possible, style guides came to me as a biggest panacea, and since around 2011 helped me to achieve great results on improving team collaboration, speeding up the development speed, and speeding up all the processes related to front-end developer within all the team members without losing the quality, of course. And style guides helps us significantly improve the consistency of front-end, both the code base and the UIs. And one of my biggest personal motivations was to participate and help community to evolve these ideas. Since back then, when I started investigating these approaches and this new whole bunch of tools, at around 2011, there was almost none of tools and none of experience shared by any other developers out there. And I was almost alone there, feeling kind of lonely. And since working in big teams, you usually have some resources for investigations. And this gives a great opportunity to dig deeper and then go to conferences and share your experience, share the things that people can't find a time to work on during their work processes and so on. That is why we also started to create and maintain a tool, which I'll mention a bit later, since this talk is not about one specific tool, it's about the evolution in general. And I will start with the history behind the style guides and covering the motives behind the people and the idea and the process of the idea evolving from first attempts to next steps. Style guides is not something new. They work here for lots of years, starting from original domain of printed style guides and brand books that designers were developing and were using to provide some guidelines for different products for the future use. And the only thing that is now changed is the format, basically. So since we are on front-end conference, of course, I will be talking about front-end style guides. And this is one of the examples, one of the best examples of basic front-end style guide, which is also a Bootstrap documentation page. And front-end style guides contains basically a set of components describing your UI kit, your library, you can call it in different ways, with some examples of usage, with some code snippets and text description. Of course, Bootstrap won't be also so popular if you won't have any guidelines, because using and reusing the code without having any structures is almost impossible. Many other companies like Ubuntu also shares their style guides publicly, combining their branding guidelines with guidelines on UI components as well. As we also saw in last day talk, about how they were achieving the responsive redesign and implementing the new layouts. So basically, style guides were also one of the first steps to first structure the ideas and then proceed with implementing those. Other companies like Lonely Planet also are sharing their style guides, and they went even further, combining the examples that they show with a real code base. So basically what you see here right now is using the same templates that they're running currently on their production website, since all the templates are directly shared between different sources, comparing to Bootstrap, where you usually copy the HTML snippets. And this basically defines the biggest challenge that developers who started implementing style guides had, is to keep the style guides in sync with the real code base, because as soon as it becomes out of date, developers will stop using it and will just most likely choose a way of reinventing the wheel and not reusing the code that was written before and not following some guidelines and best practices defined by the teams who were really putting a lot of efforts of defining those rules and so on. And basically, one of the first players in the field that helped us to create a really synced and living style guides was a KSS. I guess most of you have heard about it or some similar tools. And basically, this is an evolution of JSDoc that allows you to put inline comments right next to your CSS code, which is then, with a simple generator tool, is creating a single page documentation pretty much similar to Bootstrap. Basically combining the description of the components together with real code, it helped and helps the developer to always be aware of the examples that you have and always think about how you present the components and how you define them as the reusable parts for later use. Anna Demenham wrote a really great pocket guide on types of style guides, both covering the designer usage workflows and front-end developer workflows, where she mentioned that websites are systems rather than pages. And as soon as we start perceiving them as that, the better. Basically, she shifted the way how we should consider web pages, not thinking about them as a monolith structures, but thinking about the components out of which they're built and the reasons of how everything was combined at the first sight. And atomic design, originally introduced by Brett Frost, is one of the best examples of guidelines that defines how we could build those design systems instead of just writing a bunch of code that generates a beautiful UI, beautiful views for us. And these guidelines, called atomic approach, helps us to group the components starting from smaller elements like buttons, then proceeding to more complex views like templates, pages, and so on, defining different rules to each of the group, because it was always hard for developers to define how much abstract the component should be, how much reusable it should be, or it should be like an out-of-the-box solution that you just take and put on one of your pages as a web form or anything else. And atomic design was also introduced together with the Pattern Lab. This is a style guide tool, which basically helps to combine the style guide workflow with real development practices. So this was the first step when style guides became to be more just regular documentation, more just Bootstrap documentation page. They were started to be combined with real workflows and cover more use cases, both for designers and developers. Also, Pattern Lab showed that front-end style guides are not only about CSS comments, and it could be organized in many different ways. So for example, Pattern Lab allows you to define a folder structure with mustache templates in it that is then generated into a beautiful style guide system with navigation, code snippets, and various testing tools for responsive testing, like resizing the screen, and other useful features. The next big step with the style guides and the workflow behind them was so-called style guide-driven development. There are also lots of talks about it, and in one of my favorite talks, Matt Fordham mentioned that style guides-driven development is the practice of using style guide as a focal point for all front-end development tasks. This approach works really, really well with a modern best practices of modular development, which are proposed and which are combined with modern standards like web components and modern frameworks that most of you use like every day. React components, Angular directives, and some libraries that start appearing from day to day are pushing you to, again, think more about the systems, think more about the elements that are building the end interface. And before these approaches, we were first thinking about which code do I need to build this page after getting the mockup from designer. But now, having those practices, we first define the reusable components on the mockup, check do we have all the components, and if we don't have some of the modules that we need to use for building a new page, we first start with creating this standalone thing, focusing only on the component itself. And using the style guide, we could also define the guidelines for later use for ourselves and for our team, of course. Basically, that means that beside our component sources, we create an entry point, which is a file with examples of usage and instructions for rendering different types of the element with different data or modifications that is then used by style guide tools that are a lot of there. So I will mention also a link to an overview of all the tools that are available in open source. And this helps to build us a beautiful style guide platforms, useful for any team members. And 2015 is preparing us for a next step that we call the style guide platform, which is also not something new. It's just a next evolution step that combines all the best practices of style guide-driven development and modular development and allows you to think about it more in a unified, consistent manner. So basically, style guide platform is more than just a documentation, more just a testing suite or sandbox. It's a powerful tool that promotes the development best practices that we have for years already. It's basically just like a helper that helps you to follow the path without forgetting all those small but really important bits of things that we need to consider during the development. And of course, it's always better to show. So before I'll go to hands-on demo, I want to mention that the demos that I will be showing are showing the real capabilities of already existing tools out there in open source. Some of things are already built, but some of things are still in prototyping stage, but they will definitely come quite soon, and we will be able to use them in everyday workflow. So let me now switch to my screen. Oh, wait a moment. Yep. So let's first follow the, sorry, yeah, the live demos are always broken. Yeah. So let's first go through the basics of living style guide during development. So basically here I have the regular component page where I'll define now a button component with the default state and a bigger element, since it's a component and could have different modifications. And I'm as you see now, I'm using also a browser sync here to see the changes instantly in the browser without going back and forward. And let's also add styles here. I have some of them prepared, except the bigger modification of the button. So let's define a bigger padding, for example, to make it different from a default one. And as you see here, we have a page as a sandbox with all the rendered components, which we could also use as a documentation page later on. So let's add some description here as well. And this is basically the page. Oh, wait a moment. Looks like somebody also left a comment here asking, I don't know if anybody see it, asking that button probably should be wider. Comes from some anonymous designer. And basically, this is a really great opportunity for me to now highlight one of my favorite features behind Style Guide platform tools, which is also available out there in open source instruments that you might get. And the tool that I will now present is basically analyzing the comment that was sent by some random designer and fixes the code for you. So you don't need to do anything. You just lay back and see how the Style Guide is becoming more well taught, and how all the things are just built like a magic. So how cool is that? How long have you been debating of automated tool that writes the code for you? Of course, I'm kidding, because this is just a video recording. But the process that I showed is basically a real process, starting from the first part where you're developing your component and testing it right next to your editor, and using the Style Guide as a collaboration platform for you and your team. So basically having the sandbox with all the components rendered there, not spread it across your production website in many different pages. Having everything in place, we could integrate a lot of interesting tools that will help us collaborating with our team. And as I showed with example with comments, basically this workflow helps us to have much less iterations and not wait for reviews that we push, that we are waiting from designers or product owners after pushing the first step of the development, and waiting till the evening or the next day when they will send us some feedback. We could just do everything right in place, not spending the time on switching contexts and so on. There are also other examples of this kind of integration for communicating through your single Style Guide page, through your single sandbox. So for example, you could define some component status right from the page without going to Jira, switching the status of the task. And basically, you could imagine a specific Jira for front-end developers, but much more lighter and integrated into your workflow. So you only need to focus on editor and your sandbox without thinking about lots of other tools like emails, like Skype chats, Jira tasks, and many different things. And here is an example of another integrated tool that you might have right next to your already built components, which allows you to leave any notes right there without, again, waiting some feedback from different input sources. This will allow to not forget about any remarks that you've been writing in your notebook during the meeting or something, but keeping everything in one place and defining some small tasks or defining some comments for later usage for you and your team members without losing anything on the way of the development process. And basically having a lots of tools, as you might see right now, developers are constantly seeing more and more services, like service for creating and generating the grid layout, services for that define some custom APIs for development and so on, a lot of tools that we see every day that helps us from one side to automate our workflow development, but from other side creates more complexity because there are just too much tools out there, and there will be even more. So having this powerful middle layer, we could have a lot of integrations right from our workplace. So imagine instead of writing an email to your colleagues asking for a review for your component, you just change a status right in the page, and notifications are pushed automatically to Slack or other places. Also, as I showed, the integration with browser sync and other various tools like JS Hint that might be integrated into the sandbox without you even needed to configure a lots of CLI tools. So just having one single platform, you could gather them all. And which is most interesting for us as developers are the integrated testing capabilities that also usually takes a lot of time if we don't have specialized tools to do this. Here is another example of a style guide page which has a bootstrap slider. And style guide platform basically allows us to take this component, put it into different template that will give us more capabilities of testing responsiveness and other things. So for example, you could also with one click generate a page with different iframes of different height to see sort of device lab. And also, since we could use this component in different pages, we could instantly create a prototypes putting the same component that we are working on and we were focusing on during the style guide-driven development to something like prototypes that you can then send to your team members or product owners that need to verify how component is built and how ready it is. Another great example that we are now working on and implementing into our style guide platform is image regression capabilities that are integrated also in one single unified experience. So let's, for example, break the component, supposing that this was done accidentally after some refactorings or changing of global styles. And let's see how style guide platform could respond on this. So basically, you could get a notification that something in some of the components was broken, and you'll get a report that will define what exactly was missing and what exactly was affected during some refactoring. Of course, it's not about reinventing the tools that are available out there. It's basically just gathering and covering all the tools, all the open source solutions written in Node.js and other libraries into one single workflow, combining them all, so we don't need to think about what's going under the hood and what's happening under the hood. Another good example that we are using quite actively is the Teams feature capabilities that allows us to change the branding layer of the component and test all the component states just scrolling the page without going again through your production website and following the user stories. This is particularly helpful if you're building your CSS framework or UI toolkit and you then need to reuse it in a bunch of different projects. This also means that as a front-end developers, we are now in full control of creating our own development environments, starting from editors that are now written in web technologies, like Atom, that you might heard about or even use already, that allows you to write plugins in JavaScript. The same now with a next step that allows us to have even more capabilities and create even more custom things that are vital for your development process. So imagine instead of having only an editor and the browser, you now have a whole platform to have a lots of tools, to have a lots of really interesting integrations right inside of it. And here's another example that I wanted to show. Yesterday, we heard a great talk about accessibility and accessibility-first approach and having sort of linting tools integrated into your workplace it will be then much more easier to follow various guidelines covering many aspects of quality assurance and many aspects of development approaches and best practices that we need to follow. So here, for example, we had a problem with the code style. We just changed it in our editor next to our playground, seeing the result of our changes as a rendered components, and seeing that everything is now passing and everything is ready to be shipped. So basically, if, for example, your style guide platform will be written in Node.js, you'll be able to integrate lots of tools that also available in open source that will just run under the hood. And even if you're familiar with some tools like Docker or Vagrant that allows you to pack a pre-configured environment into like closed black box that will just allow you to run all the tools with all the configuration working for each team member in exactly the same manner. So with those capabilities, you'll be able to just, with one click, to set up all the development environment without any specific problems. Here's another most recent example of things that you might implement right next to your playground, which is a component playground for React components that not only shows you the rendered element, like this button here, but also allows you to change the code and to see how your changes are affected right in place without, again, setting up lots of tools, connecting many libraries, and refreshing the pages. The authors of this specific playground also are using this in the same way, enhancing their documentation and making it more useful, evolutionizing the way how we treat documentations. And I bet you already have lots of ideas how these tools might be used in your everyday workflow, but let me share some experience that we had and how we've been implementing these style guide-driven approaches in our development workflows. So the basic way is when designers are pushing some mockups to the developers, the front-end developers, and they are starting building new components, focusing more on the modules first through the style guide, following the approaches that I demoed before. Later on, designers could also use a style guide as a reference for all the components that are there already in your library. And even if they could code, or if you provide them some kind of playground for changing styles, changing themes, they could also interact directly with this single entry point, collaborating through one unified bridge that allows us to speak in one common language. And of course, style guides are working as a great deliverable, so you could push or send links to build prototypes to your managers, to your testers, showing them the result at the end of the sprint. And then after everything is verified, you could proceed building production pages out of the components that you already mastered, that are passing all the tests, and are verified by various team members. At BACKBASE, we are now going even a bit further, and as a product that we ship to the client contains both basic UI components and ready-built widgets available to use out of the box. We also ship a copy of the style guide platform with all the tools inside, and basically treating a style guide as a feature. We could provide clients not only the code, not only the documentation, but also a set of tools that they might use for proceeding the work on it and extending the components library. So basically, having this workflow on one side, on product side, we are not sending then a link to a client to our existing version, but we are sending a copy. And how I mentioned, this could be configured with like one-click install, setting up all the linting tools, setting up everything developers on or other end might need and might use for keeping the quality and keeping the structure that you first defined. So basically that means that Style Guide platform is the tool that gathers all the best practices that are now appearing and will be appearing even more in the future, like various build tools, various tools for organizing the workflow, organizing the tasks, and so on, and creates a single way, single easy workflow that will just help you to not think about anything and not keeping all those smaller steps in your head. And as I mentioned before, we also are working on a Style Guide platform as an open source solution. Not all of the features that I showed are available there, but basically following the modular structure that we were implemented from the start, it's easy to extend everything with your specific plugins, with your specific integrations. And actually, all of this is just the beginning. So as I said, we'll have even more tools in the future. We'll have even more complex workflows, and we need to start thinking about how to make them more consistent, how to manage them all without melting our brains. And there are still a lot of challenges to solve, and also we have a lot of questions and a lot of things to solve, like a dependency management and other things, maintaining a modular development at scale. And I bet you'll have a lot of questions on how we're treating this and working with it in our company or with those specific set of tools. So definitely catch me and my colleague Justina, that is also here with me today. She speaks Polish, by the way, as well, so it might be easier for you. And ask everything you want to know about those workflows and about those approaches that we as a company could share with the community and share our experience of doing things. So summing up, here are a few takeaways that you might remember and highlight. So basically, as I mentioned a few times, Style Guide is a single entry point for all the processes and all of your team members, both designers, testers, not only the developers. Style Guides are helping to maintain consistency, not only in the code base, but in UI, which is also really important for branding and for user experience as well. And embracing the best practices, all this set of features could greatly improve the team collaboration and help us to understand each other more than we are now, more than we are now having, and working even closer and common goals. So for further investigations, you could follow a few links that I listed here. So as I mentioned, I have a Style Guides tools overview where I covered all the open source solutions available out there that you might use already to build the same experiences. And of course, you could follow me on Twitter, since I will post the same links without you needed to remembering all the short links here. So that's basically it. Thanks for having me, and thank you. Not sure if we have time for questions, but anyway, if we won't, then just catch me and Justina during the day or at the after party. We'll be there ready to answer all of your questions and show some demos.
I think we can take a few questions now.
Okay.
Yeah, we still have some time.
Hi.
Hey.
Thanks for your talk. It was really good. I really like Source.js. I haven't heard of it before, but so great. My biggest problem with existing Style Guides platforms is that they don't handle very well reusability, especially with theming between different projects. So I wonder, how do you handle that? So if, let's say you have a component with set of core behavior and styles, and then you have a pile of different themes per different project. Do you keep your component in a different repository, and how do you separate that version control?
Yeah, I have actually some posts about structuring the code base that is covered by the style guide. Actually, there are few approaches. So one of the best approaches is to have like triangle architecture where you have a style guide that is referencing to your components library as a standalone unit. So you have your components library and separate repository with your own versions that you might then define as a dependency to any various projects or to your style guide as well. So the component itself, just component library itself, just leaving as a dependency like any npm package, and then could be reused by any other projects, just as installing Bower npm dependency, and that's basically it. Any other questions? Here.
I want to ask you if is any integration with CI, continuous integration, because you test accessibility and others.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, if you are working in the way and treating the style guide as a platform, you don't need to have a separate CI. So basically, this platform itself is a CI for you that does all those tests right in place. Of course, that doesn't remove the necessity of having CI that will check everything after you push the code in your repository, where you could run the same tests. But with style guide platform, you might have it not as a standalone service. You might have it right in your machine, testing it really fast and efficient during your development workflow. So if that's it, then just catch me for demos. I will show you how the code is structured, how it could be organized, and how we use it in our teams, and how we manage it at scale. So thank you again for having me here.